At 6:37 in the morning, my banking app flashed one red line reading, "Access denied." My $670,000 trust fund was frozen overnight. I called my mother, but my father answered the phone. He said softly that they had to step in because family always comes first. I did not argue or scream. I drove straight to the bank and set my identification on the counter. The branch manager clicked his mouse once, turned the monitor toward me, and asked who signed this power of attorney 5 days ago. Then he opened the metadata, and the room went completely silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to protect you. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old and I hunt fraud for a living. As a forensic accountant, my days are spent tracing hidden assets, uncovering corporate embezzlement, and catching white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the digital trails they leave behind. I track missing millions for massive clients all over the country. I never once thought my next major financial investigation would be centered around my own parents and my older brother. It started as a regular Tuesday morning. I woke up in my downtown apartment, poured a cup of dark roast coffee, and opened my laptop to check my personal accounts. It is a strict habit born from my profession because you always have to verify your own security. When I logged into the portal holding the trust fund, my late aunt left me, the screen completely froze. A bold red banner appeared across the top of the dashboard. It stated that my account was frozen due to the activation of a power of attorney. I did not panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who do not understand how money moves. I picked up my phone and called my parents. They live in a massive, meticulously decorated house in a wealthy suburb paid for by years of keeping up appearances at their exclusive country club and sitting in the very front pews of our church every Sunday. My father, Marcus, answered on the second ring. He did not sound surprised to hear my voice. I asked him directly why my trust account was locked down. He sighed heavily, using that deep, authoritative voice he always reserved for moments when he expected me to just fall in line and obey. "Maya," he said, "we had to step in and do something. Trey is going through a rough patch right now. You know how much pressure your brother is under with his real estate business. Family comes first, and we will figure all of the details out later." My mother, Valerie, chimed in from the background. I could hear her telling him to remind me that, as a single woman with no husband and no children, I did not need all that money sitting around doing nothing. I hung up the phone without saying another word. I did not cry and I did not yell at them. I went to my closet, put on my sharpest tailored suit, grabbed my briefcase, and drove straight to the main branch of my bank. Growing up, the dynamic in our household was always painfully clear. My brother Trey was 3 years older than me, and he was the undisputed golden child. He was the charismatic, handsome entrepreneur who could do no wrong. I was the quiet, introverted daughter who analyzed spreadsheets and stayed out of the way. In my parents' eyes, my success was never really mine. It was merely a backup plan to fund Trey and his lavish lifestyle whenever he stumbled. They called it supporting the family and honoring our culture. In the real world, it is called the black tax. It is the unspoken toxic expectation that the responsible one must carry the financial weight of the reckless ones just to keep the family image perfectly intact. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the bank and walked right past the teller line straight into the office of Mr. Sterling, the branch manager. He knew me extremely well. We had worked together on several fraud investigations for his corporate clients in the past. When he saw the look on my face, he immediately ushered me into his office and closed the blinds for privacy. I placed my driver license on his mahogany desk and asked to see the exact documentation that triggered my account freeze. Mr. Sterling typed rapidly on his keyboard, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He turned his flat-screen monitor to face me. Displayed on the screen was a comprehensive power of attorney document, supposedly granting my brother Trey full legal control over all my financial assets. The document falsely stated that I was undergoing severe mental stress and was completely unfit to manage my own funds. At the bottom of the page was my signature. It was a very convincing forgery, but as a trained forensic accountant, I immediately spotted the incorrect pressure points and unnatural curves in the digital ink. I asked Mr. Sterling to pull up the electronic metadata for the signature file. In my line of work, arrogant people always forget that digital signatures carry invisible permanent fingerprints. Mr. Sterling opened the hidden properties of the PDF file. The metadata showed exactly when and where the document was generated and signed. The IP address did not match my apartment or my corporate office. I pulled out my phone, cross-referenced the IP address with public property records, and felt a cold, sharp knot form in my stomach. The document had been signed from the exact IP address registered to Trey and his wife Brittany at their custom-built mansion. Worse than that, the two mandatory witness signatures at the bottom of the legal page belonged to my parents, Marcus and Valerie. They had orchestrated this entire crime together. My own parents had perjured themselves and committed federal wire fraud to hand my entire life savings over to my golden child brother. They actually believed that because I was their daughter, I would just accept the theft to keep the peace. They thought I would bow my head, swallow my pride, and protect Trey and his white wife from facing any real consequences. They forgot who I am and what I do every single day. As I leaned closer to the monitor to examine the fake notary stamp, a sudden notification popped up in the top right corner of Mr. Sterling's screen. It was an automated emergency alert from the bank High Wealth Division. Mr. Sterling went completely pale and stopped breathing for a second. He looked at me with his eyes wide in absolute shock. Someone had not just frozen the account to keep me out. Using the fake power of attorney, an authorized user had just leveraged my entire trust to secure a massive line of credit. $500,000 had just been wired out of my account in a single untraceable transaction. The money was gone. I left the bank holding a printed copy of the forged document and the wire transfer metadata. My hands did not shake. In my line of work, emotion is a liability. Data is the only truth. I got into my car and plugged my brother Trey's address into the GPS. He lived in a sprawling modern mansion in a gated community, 45 minutes away. Today was the first Sunday of the month, which meant my parents were hosting their massive family cookout at his house. They loved parading his success in front of our extended family. I pulled up to the curb and parked behind a long line of luxury cars. The heavy bass of 90s R&B music thumped through the warm afternoon air. Smoke from the grill carried the rich scent of barbecue ribs and brisket down the paved driveway. I walked through the side gate into the backyard. Dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins were laughing, holding red plastic cups and playing competitive games of spades on the patio. It was the absolute picture of a perfect, prosperous family. Nobody out there knew that the pristine green grass they were standing on was about to be funded by my stolen life savings. Trey was standing by the outdoor kitchen wearing a crisp white polo shirt and holding a pair of stainless steel tongs. He flashed his signature bright smile when he saw me walk across the lawn. He looked completely unbothered for a man who had just committed federal wire fraud. Before I could even approach him, my father stepped directly into my path. Marcus grabbed my elbow with a grip that was far too tight for a casual family gathering. His eyes darted around the yard, making sure none of the relatives were paying attention to us. My mother Valerie suddenly appeared on my other side. Her usual warm Sunday smile was completely absent. Her face was tight, and her voice was a sharp hiss as she told me to go straight into the kitchen through the back door. They marched me away from the music and the laughter like a prisoner being escorted to an interrogation room. The kitchen was a massive expanse of white marble and stainless steel appliances. It was completely empty of guests. The moment the heavy glass door clicked shut behind us, the ambient noise of the party vanished into a suffocating silence. Valerie did not waste a single second. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a manila folder. She slapped a single sheet of paper onto the marble island and shoved a silver pen toward me. It was a consent to power of attorney form, backdated to last Tuesday. It was the exact legal document they needed to legitimize the forgery and clear themselves of the major crime I had just uncovered at the bank. My father leaned his heavy frame against the counter, crossing his arms. He used the same booming baritone voice he used to command the church congregation every weekend. He told me to sign the paper immediately so we could put this tiny misunderstanding behind us and go back outside to enjoy our family. I looked down at the paper and then up at the two people who raised me. I asked them why they thought I would ever sign away $670,000 of my own money to cover up their felony. Valerie stepped closer, her voice dripping with a toxic mixture of desperation and blatant condescension. She told me I was being entirely too dramatic over money I was not even using. She said Trey was drowning in debt because the commercial real estate market had shifted. He was on the verge of losing his firm and this beautiful house. She looked me up and down with clear disgust. She reminded me that I was 32 years old, single, and completely alone. She said I had no husband to support and no children to feed. According to her, my money was just sitting in an account doing nothing for the family legacy. Trey had a wife and a future to maintain. She actually had the audacity to say that it was my duty as his sister to step up and carry the financial weight when my brother stumbled. It was the ultimate toxic expectation that I should sacrifice my independence for his ego. I stared at her, letting the absolute absurdity of her words wash over me. She was openly demanding that I surrender my entire financial security simply because I did not fit her narrow definition of a successful woman. Because I chose to build a career in forensic accounting instead of marrying young and hosting country club dinners, my assets were considered community property for the golden boy to harvest. I told them no. I said the word calmly and clearly. I told them the bank manager had already flagged the transaction, and I had the metadata proving they orchestrated the theft from this exact house. Marcus slammed his hand down on the marble countertop, causing the decorative fruit bowl to rattle. His face turned a dangerous shade of red. He stepped directly into my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. He told me I was going to sign the paper right now, because if I did not, the bank would call the federal authorities. He screamed that I would be responsible for sending my own flesh and blood to prison. He said the entire family and our entire church community would hate me forever for destroying our pristine reputation and ruining Trey's life. They were trying to weaponize my loyalty to the family to save themselves from a prison sentence. I did not back up a single inch. I told my father that Trey ruined his own life the moment he decided to steal from someone who hunts financial criminals for a living. I told them the money was already wired out, and I wanted to know exactly where my $500,000 went. Valerie opened her mouth to feed me another lie about saving Trey's business, but she never got the chance to speak. The heavy wooden door leading to the main hallway swung open. The tension in the kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife, but the person walking into the room was completely oblivious to the chaos. It was Brittany, my brother's 30-year-old wife. She strolled into the kitchen, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder and wearing a self-satisfied smirk that made my blood boil. She did not even look at the legal documents scattered across the island or the pure panic radiating from my parents' faces. Instead, she walked straight toward the espresso machine, casually carrying a brand-new pristine leather Hermes Birkin bag on her arm. Brittany set the heavy luxury bag directly on top of the forged legal documents scattered across the marble island. She smoothed her perfectly highlighted blonde hair and let out a dramatic performative sigh. She looked me up and down, taking in my tailored suit with a gaze full of thinly veiled pity. She leaned against the counter, intentionally pressing her hip against my brother Trey. Her entire demeanor radiated the kind of arrogant entitlement that only comes from knowing you are shielded from any real consequences. She looked at my parents and then turned her piercing blue eyes toward me. She spoke in that sickeningly sweet therapy voice she always used when she wanted to sound intellectually superior. You know, Maya, I have been doing a lot of reading lately about generational wealth in the Black community. I have been attending my anti-racism book club and learning so much about your cultural traditions. It is all about the village right. You guys share everything. It is such a beautiful concept to support your family no matter what. You sitting on all that money as a single woman with no husband and absolutely no children to feed is just deeply selfish. We are family. Do not be a bitter, angry single woman, Maya. Trey is building a legacy for our children. You should be honored to contribute to your nephew and niece instead of hoarding wealth you do not even need. My father nodded in enthusiastic agreement, crossing his arms over his chest. My mother Valerie smiled at her white daughter-in-law, as if Brittany had just delivered a profound sermon from the pulpit. They were entirely willing to let this woman stand in their kitchen and weaponize my own culture against me just to justify their federal crime. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to argue about family dynamics or defend my relationship status. They expected the typical emotional reaction that they could easily dismiss as an angry outburst. I did not argue about family. I did not defend my single status. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice absolutely completely flat. I lowered my gaze to the pristine leather bag resting on the marble counter. I leaned forward slightly, inspecting the stitching and the gleaming metal clasp. Hermes Birkin 35, I stated calmly. Togo leather in the color gold with palladium hardware. A classic choice for someone desperate to look like old money. Brittany snatched her hand away from the bag, her smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She lifted her chin defiantly and told me that her husband bought it for her as a well-deserved push present for handling the stress of his business restructuring. She claimed he bought it from a private dealer in New York just last week. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. As a forensic accountant, I do not just track missing funds for corporate clients. I build digital tripwires into my own financial networks. When I demanded the bank manager activate the federal fraud protocol earlier that morning, I also downloaded the raw transaction ledger for the line of credit they had illegally opened against my trust fund. I opened the encrypted file on my screen and scrolled down to the most recent clearing data. I did not look at Trey. I kept my eyes locked dead on Brittany. I read the numbers aloud. Transaction identification code 4492. Processed yesterday at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. Point of sale terminal registered to an elite luxury resale boutique in the Miami Design District. Total amount charged $22,450. The color instantly drained from Brittany's face, leaving her looking pale and terrified. I took one step closer to the marble island, forcing her to step back. I continued speaking with surgical precision. The funds were pulled from a Visa card ending in 4402. That specific card is linked directly to the credit line secured by my stolen trust fund. You did not get this from a private dealer in New York last week, Brittany. You flew to Miami yesterday and bought it using my stolen money while pretending you were at a weekend wellness retreat. You used my parents as human shields to forge a document so you could play rich housewife on my dime. Black culture does not teach us to steal from our own blood to fund a designer shopping spree. Do not ever speak to me about my culture again. Trey stared at his wife, his jaw dropping in genuine confusion. He asked her what I was talking about. He asked her why she was in Miami when she told him she was at a spa in Sedona. The supposed golden child did not even know the full extent of the theft his own wife had orchestrated. Brittany started stammering aggressively. She pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed that I was lying. She yelled that I was manipulating banking data to destroy her marriage because I was jealous of her perfect life. My parents panicked. The entire narrative they had constructed to justify their theft was collapsing in real time, right in their own kitchen. The illusion of the noble business bailout was shattered by a $22,000 handbag. Marcus shouted my name, demanding I put my phone away and stop making up ridiculous lies. Right at that exact second, the heavy wooden door swinging from the backyard patio creaked open. The loud bass line of the music outside flooded the room for a brief moment. Aunt Denise walked into the kitchen carrying a massive glass bowl of potato salad. She stopped dead in her tracks, taking in the scene. She looked at the legal documents on the counter, the designer bag, and my phone. She asked loudly what we were talking about and who was stealing money. Valerie reacted with pure, unadulterated desperation. She could not let Aunt Denise hear the truth. She could not let the extended family know that the pristine image of her golden son and his perfect wife was entirely funded by felony fraud. Valerie lunged forward across the space. She raised her hand and slapped me across the face with everything she had. The sharp crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed off the marble countertops and the stainless steel appliances. The physical impact forced my head to snap to the side. My cheek burned instantly. Aunt Denise dropped the serving spoon onto the floor in absolute shock. Valerie did not hesitate for a single second. She immediately burst into violent theatrical tears. She grabbed her own chest, pretending to hyperventilate. She screamed at Aunt Denise that I was sick. She wailed that I had stopped taking my medication and I was having a severe mental breakdown. She sobbed a fabricated story, claiming I was hallucinating about money and hacking into fake bank accounts because my mind was deteriorating from the loneliness of being a single woman. She begged Aunt Denise to go back outside and keep the guests away while they dealt with my tragic psychiatric episode. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my hand to touch my burning cheek. I did not scream back. I simply looked at my mother putting on the performance of a lifetime to protect a thief. I looked at Trey, who was staring at the floor, refusing to make eye contact. I looked at Brittany, who was clutching the stolen bag like a shield. The slap was everything I needed. It was the absolute confirmation that there was nothing left to save here. They had made their choice. They chose the illusion over their own daughter. I slowly turned my head back to face my mother. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy or submission. It was the smile of a predator who had just locked the cage from the outside. I did not utter a single word of defense. I turned on my heel, pushed past a horrified Aunt Denise, and walked straight out the back door toward my car, leaving them trapped in the nightmare they had just created. The drive back to my apartment was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows to feel the warm afternoon breeze. My left cheek still burned with a dull, pulsing heat from where my mother had struck me, but I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to pain and emotional devastation. I was entirely past the concept of emotional devastation. I had entered a state of absolute clinical focus. By the time I pulled my car into my secure parking garage, the initial shock of the cookout ambush had crystallized into pure, unfiltered determination. My parents and my brother had severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They viewed my career as just another boring office job. They thought I had a quiet little spreadsheet hobby that could never compete with Trey and his loud, flashy real estate ventures. They had absolutely no concept of what forensic accounting actually entails. They did not understand that numbers always tell a story, and the story never lies. I unlocked the heavy oak door to my apartment and walked straight past the living room directly into my home office. This room was my sanctuary. It was a climate-controlled space dominated by a custom-built desk and a massive array of ultra-high-definition monitors. I set my briefcase on the floor, took a deep breath, and powered up my workstation. The servers hummed to life with a quiet, steady vibration that immediately grounded my thoughts. I bypassed my standard personal network and booted up my proprietary forensic software. This was the exact same heavily encrypted system I used to track international corporate embezzlement, catch corrupt executives, and dismantle multi-million-dollar fraud rings for my corporate clients. Today, I was turning those powerful crosshairs directly onto my own bloodline. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and pulled up the raw data ledger I had extracted from Mr. Sterling's office at the bank earlier that morning. The initial fraudulent transaction was painfully obvious. Exactly $500,000 had been drawn against a line of credit secured by my trust fund. The money was wired out in one massive lump sum just 48 hours ago. My parents had justified this unforgivable theft by claiming Trey desperately needed the capital to save his failing commercial real estate business. They passionately sold me the narrative that my stolen money was going to rescue the family legacy. I cracked my knuckles, positioned my hands over the mechanical keyboard, and began to follow the digital money trail. My very first target was Trey and his primary business accounts. I accessed the public financial filings, state business registries, and corporate tax records for his highly publicized real estate development firm. It did not take very long to see exactly why Valerie and Marcus were panicking in their kitchen. Trey was not just experiencing a temporary rough patch. His company was a sinking ship, rapidly taking on water from every side. He was leveraged to the absolute maximum, heavily delinquent on multiple commercial building loans and facing impending foreclosure on his two largest flagship properties. The financial statements I pulled were a complete disaster class in financial mismanagement and arrogant overspending. However, when I ran the routing numbers from the stolen $500,000 against his corporate ledgers, I found absolutely nothing. The stolen funds had never touched his business accounts. Not a single cent of my money had been applied to his crushing corporate debts. I leaned closer to the center monitor, narrowing my eyes at the screen. If the money did not go to save the supposed family legacy, then where did it go? Amateurs and criminals always think they can hide cash by moving it incredibly fast, but money never actually disappears. It simply changes its shape and its location. I initiated a deep trace protocol on the receiving routing number from the original bank wire. The software chewed through the encrypted banking data and spit out the first destination. The $500,000 had landed in a small regional bank account in Delaware, registered to an anonymous holding company. I quickly pulled the incorporation documents for that specific entity. It had been established less than 30 days ago. It was a classic shell company created solely to receive and instantly redirect illicit funds without triggering federal red flags. I followed the money straight out of Delaware. Less than an hour after landing in that first account, the massive funds were fractured into 3 separate wire transfers. This is a textbook money laundering technique known as layering. It is designed to confuse financial investigators and bury the original source of the cash under a mountain of paperwork. The first chunk of money bounced to a newly formed limited liability company in Nevada. The second chunk hit a corporate trust registered in Wyoming. The third chunk was routed through a silent partnership operating in South Dakota. They were specifically using states with the strictest corporate secrecy laws in the country to mask their digital footprints. I spent the next 2 hours systematically dismantling every single protective layer they had built. I ran advanced cross-reference checks on the registered agents, the virtual office addresses, and the digital timestamps of the rapid transfers. I stripped away the Nevada Shell Company, the Wyoming Trust, and the South Dakota Partnership. I forced my forensic software to aggregate the dispersed funds and strictly track their secondary movements. The 3 separate streams of stolen money eventually converged back together in a single holding account stationed in a major bank in New York. From there, the entire sum was pushed through a high-speed international wire transfer gateway. The money had officially left the United States banking system. I tapped my spacebar, watching the final destination load onto the black screen of my main monitor. The $500,000 had finally settled into an offshore banking account located in the Cayman Islands. I utilized my international registry access to identify the ultimate beneficiary of that specific offshore account. The account was directly tied to a private limited liability company registered in France. I sat back in my chair and stared at the glowing white text on my monitor. A French holding company. I ran the data through my software twice more just to ensure absolute undeniable accuracy. The final result remained identical both times. The money was sitting securely in a Caribbean tax haven, completely controlled by a French business entity. I picked up my coffee mug, took a sip of cold, dark roast, and let the stunning reality of the situation sink in. Trey had never been to France. Trey barely passed high school French and certainly did not possess the high-level financial sophistication required to set up a multi-layered international money laundering operation through Delaware, Wyoming, and the Cayman Islands. My parents were completely technically illiterate. They still constantly struggled to connect their cell phones to the wireless internet router at their house. They could never execute a transnational wire fraud scheme of this magnitude. Trey had not planned this elaborate crime. My parents had not orchestrated the final international destination of this theft. They were just the greedy, desperate pawns who willingly forged the initial signature to get the cash. Trey was not the brilliant mastermind behind this massive theft. He was the mark. Monday morning arrived with the cold, bright light of absolute clarity. I was sitting at my desk in my corner office on the 40th floor of my corporate accounting firm. The panoramic view of the downtown skyline stretched out behind me, but my eyes were locked entirely on my dual monitors. I had spent the entire night analyzing the offshore routing data, verifying the connection between my stolen trust fund and the French holding company. Trey was a pawn in a much larger game, and I was meticulously building the exact timeline of his impending financial ruin. I was just about to initiate a background check on the French corporate registry when the intercom on my desk buzzed. The receptionist sounded extremely hesitant. She told me that my parents were waiting in the lobby, and they had brought a guest who insisted it was a family emergency. I did not have to guess who they brought. Marcus and Valerie walked through the heavy glass doors of my office a few moments later. They did not come alone. Following closely behind them was Pastor Thomas, the highly influential head of our local megachurch. In our community, the pastor is not just a spiritual leader. He is a political figure, a social powerhouse, and a man of absolute authority. Bringing him into my corporate workspace was a heavily calculated power play. It was a tactical maneuver designed to publicly shame me into submission. My parents sat down in the leather guest chairs opposite my desk. Pastor Thomas stood between them, holding a leather-bound Bible, wearing an expensive tailored suit that cost more than most people make in a month. Valerie immediately launched into the performance of a lifetime. She did not yell or slap me today. Instead, she played the role of the tragic, heartbroken mother. She pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at the corners of her eyes, crying soft, manufactured tears. Marcus placed a heavy, comforting hand on her shoulder, playing the stoic, burdened patriarch. They looked at the pastor and told him that their daughter was completely lost. They claimed they had come to my office because I was suffering from a severe psychotic break. Marcus used his deep, resonant voice to spin a terrifying and entirely fabricated narrative. He looked at the pastor and explained that I had shown up at their family cookout the day before, completely unhinged. He said I was hallucinating wild stories about stolen money and offshore bank accounts. He told the pastor that my demanding career and my lonely status as a single woman had finally broken my fragile mind. Then Marcus dropped the actual weapon he had come to use. He looked me dead in the eye and said the word conservatorship. He calmly stated that he and Valerie had already spoken to a family lawyer. They claimed that because I was legally incompetent and suffering from paranoid delusions, they were preparing to petition the court to take total control over my remaining financial assets. They framed it as an act of profound parental love to protect me from myself. Valerie sobbed louder, nodding in agreement. She looked at Pastor Thomas and begged him to intervene. She said the devil had filled my heart with greed and toxic independence. She claimed I was trying to destroy my own brother out of pure jealousy because Trey had a beautiful wife and a successful business. They wanted the pastor to act as their ultimate character witness. When they filed their fraudulent conservatorship paperwork, they planned to use his sworn testimony to prove to a judge that I was completely insane. Pastor Thomas stepped forward, placing both of his hands firmly on my desk. He looked down at me with an expression of profound condescension and manufactured pity. He did not ask for my side of the story. He simply bowed his head, closed his eyes, and began to pray right there in the middle of my corporate office. He prayed loudly for my broken mind. He asked for divine intervention to cast out the demons of selfishness and isolation. He prayed that I would surrender my arrogant pride and submit to the loving authority of my parents. He asked that my heart be softened so I would stop spreading malicious lies about my righteous brother. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair and let him finish his entire performance. I did not interrupt him. I did not defend my sanity or scream at my parents for threatening me with a conservatorship. When the pastor finally opened his eyes and said amen, I simply reached out and placed my hands on my keyboard. I looked directly at Pastor Thomas. I told him that I highly respected his spiritual authority in the community, but he had just walked into an active crime scene completely blindfolded. I told him my parents did not bring him here to save my soul. They brought him here to buy an alibi. I dragged my mouse across the screen and clicked on a specific digital file I had compiled earlier that morning. I turned my laptop around so the high-definition screen was facing the pastor directly. I told him that I hunt financial fraud for a living, and that numbers are the only things in this world that never lie. Displayed brightly on my monitor was the public donation ledger for his megachurch, which I had easily accessed through their corporate transparency portal. I pointed to a specific line item recorded during yesterday's Sunday morning service. It was a massive $25,000 donation marked as a special blessing. The donors listed were Marcus and Valerie. I watched the pastor's chest swell with pride for a fraction of a second before I completely dismantled him. I opened a second window side by side with the church ledger. It was the federal banking metadata from my stolen trust fund. I highlighted the routing number from the fraudulent wire transfer and matched it perfectly digit for digit with the electronic routing number attached to the church donation. I kept my voice ice cold and razor sharp. I explained to the pastor that the $25,000 blessing he accepted yesterday was not a miracle. It was the direct proceed of federal wire fraud. I told him my parents had forged a legal document, stolen my life savings, and then immediately used a portion of that stolen money to buy his loyalty and fund his church. I informed him that the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation do not grant religious exemptions for money laundering. I told him that by accepting those funds and refusing to report the origin, his massive tax-exempt church was now legally implicated in a federal felony. The color drained entirely from Pastor Thomas' face. His confident, authoritative posture collapsed in an instant. He stared at the glowing numbers on the screen, and his hands began to tremble. Pastor Thomas took 2 steps backward away from my desk as if my laptop were on fire. He did not say another prayer. He did not offer a single word of spiritual guidance to my parents. He muttered a frantic apology, grabbed his leather-bound Bible, and practically ran out of my glass office doors. My father Marcus watched his ultimate character witness flee in absolute silence. The religious shield they had tried to hide behind was completely shattered. Valerie's face twisted into a mask of pure spite. She pointed a manicured finger at me and screamed that I had lost my mind and that I would pay for disrespecting this family. Marcus grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the exit, promising over his shoulder that I would be hearing from their legal counsel before the week was over. They did not wait long to make good on that threat. The very next morning, a process server stepped off the elevator onto my floor and handed the receptionist a thick manila envelope directed to me. I took the envelope back to my desk and sliced it open. Inside was a formal cease and desist order, accompanied by a highly aggressive draft of a defamation lawsuit. The paperwork demanded I immediately stop making false financial accusations against Trey, Valerie, and Marcus. It stated that my malicious lies were causing severe emotional distress and damaging my brother's business reputation. The letterhead belonged to Richard Vance. In our city, Richard Vance was a notorious high-priced legal bulldog who specialized in making wealthy families' problems disappear through sheer intimidation and endless litigation. My parents thought that they could terrorize me into silence by hiring the most ruthless shark in the corporate district. They assumed I would take one look at the heavy legal jargon and back down out of fear of a massive civil trial. They clearly forgot that I dissect complex legal financial structures every single day before I even take my lunch break. I did not call a defense attorney. I did not write an emotional email to my parents begging them to stop. I picked up the lawsuit, folded it neatly into my briefcase, and drove straight across town to the Vance law firm. I walked into his reception area on the top floor of a high-rise building and calmly told his assistant that I was the subject of his latest cease and desist order. I said I was there to resolve the issue directly. Richard Vance had me brought into his corner office within 5 minutes, likely assuming I was there to surrender and beg for a settlement. He sat behind a massive glass desk, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit projecting an aura of absolute arrogance. He did not offer me a seat. He simply leaned back and told me that if I did not sign a non-disclosure agreement and formally retract all statements regarding my brother and his financial situation, he would tie me up in court until I was bankrupt. He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who was used to bullying people into submission. I waited for him to finish his entire monologue. Then I pulled a single piece of paper from my briefcase and placed it directly in the center of his pristine glass desk. I did not yell, and I did not argue about defamation. I kept my voice strictly professional and completely devoid of emotion. I told him that as an officer of the court, he had a legal and ethical obligation to verify the source of his retainer fees. Vance frowned and looked down at the document. It was a complete forensic trace of the $50,000 retainer fee my parents had paid his firm just 24 hours prior. I stood over his desk and narrated the financial journey for him. I explained that the money had originated from my frozen trust account. I traced how it was illegally wired to a shell company in Delaware, then bounced to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, controlled by a French entity. Finally, I showed him the exact routing number, where a fraction of those stolen funds was transferred straight into his firm primary operating account. I watched his arrogant expression evaporate. I leaned forward and informed him that under federal law, accepting money derived from wire fraud is a felony. I explained that by taking that $50,000 retainer to intimidate the primary victim of the theft, he was no longer just a hired family lawyer. He was actively participating in the laundering of stolen funds and operating as an accessory after the fact to federal wire fraud. I told him that I had already prepared a secondary dossier to submit to the State Bar Association and the Federal Bureau of Investigation detailing his firm knowing receipt of illicit money. Richard Vance was a predator, but he was not an idiot. His survival instinct kicked in immediately. The color drained from his face, matching the exact same shade of panic Pastor Thomas had displayed the day before. He realized in a fraction of a second that my parents had lied to him and handed him radioactive money that could destroy his entire career. He did not say a word to defend them. He immediately picked up his desk phone and dialed his accounting department, instructing them to reverse the $50,000 wire transfer back to the sender effective immediately. Then he opened his email client and began typing a formal withdrawal of representation letter to my father right in front of me. I did not wait for him to hit send. I picked up my paper, turned around, and walked out of his office, leaving the formidable bulldog scrambling to save his own law license. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The quiet hum of the descending elevator was deeply satisfying. Just as the doors opened to the ground floor, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw my brother's name flashing across the screen. I let it go to voicemail and walked toward my car. 2 minutes later, an audio file notification popped up. I pressed play and held the phone to my ear. It was Trey. His usual smooth, arrogant tone was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, breathless panic. He was screaming into the phone, demanding to know what I had just done to their lawyer. He sounded cornered, desperate, and unhinged. He shouted that I was destroying his life and ruining his marriage. Then his voice dropped into a dark, aggressive threat, warning me that if I did not stop digging into the French holding company, I would regret it for the rest of my life. I pulled the phone away from my ear and ended the call. Trey was screaming so loudly, the audio had actually distorted. I did not text him back. I did not leave a return voicemail to argue or defend myself. I walked to my car, started the engine, and programmed the navigation system for the downtown commercial district. It was time to pay my older brother a personal visit. Trey operated his real estate development firm out of a high-end commercial suite that screamed desperate new money. The building lobby was lined with imported Italian marble and featured a massive waterfall wall with his company logo embossed in brushed steel. It was the exact kind of flashy, performative wealth designed to make investors believe he was a highly successful mogul. I walked straight past the front desk receptionist, completely ignoring her demands to sign in, and pushed open the heavy glass doors to his private corner office. Trey was pacing aggressively behind his custom mahogany desk. When he saw me walking through his door, his momentary panic vanished and was masked instantly by his lifelong, arrogant entitlement. He straightened his expensive designer tie and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He asked me if I came to apologize for embarrassing our parents at the corporate office and harassing his expensive lawyer. He leaned against the edge of his desk and unleashed a barrage of toxic insults. He told me I was nothing but a bitter, jealous woman. He said I was furiously trying to tear him down because he had a beautiful wife, a massive house, and a booming business, while I went home to an empty apartment every single night. I stood in the center of the room and let him vent his fragile ego. I did not interrupt him as he weaponized my single status. In our family, my career was always viewed as a tragic consolation prize for not having a husband. Trey used that exact cultural conditioning against me. He said my forensic accounting job was just a distraction from my miserable, lonely reality. He told me that Brittany was the gold standard of a wife, and that I should take notes instead of throwing temper tantrums over money I did not even know how to spend. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. I asked him directly about the forged power of attorney and the $500,000 stolen from my trust fund. Trey did not even flinch. He smirked and proudly admitted to signing the fraudulent document. He crossed his arms and told me he completely deserved that money to build the family empire. He bragged that Marcus and Valerie would always choose him over me no matter what he did. He said our parents would gladly lie under oath to protect him because he was the son, the legacy, and the golden boy of the family. He leaned forward, invading my personal space, and told me the police would never believe an angry black woman over a respected church elder and a successful businessman. He said the system was built to protect men like him, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. He was so incredibly confident in his absolute immunity. He thought his gender, his loud voice, and our parents' blind loyalty gave him a permanent shield against reality. He was so busy trying to intimidate me that he completely forgot to hide his incoming mail. I did not react to his racial gaslighting or his cruel taunts. I did not raise my voice or clench my fists. Instead, my eyes drifted downward past his tailored suit to the surface of his pristine desk. Scattered across the polished wood were dozens of letters printed on heavy legal paper. As a financial investigator, I have spent years reading documents just like those. My eyes scanned the bold red text stamped across the top of the open envelopes. I read the words, "Notice of Default." I saw a final eviction warning from his commercial landlord. I spotted a delinquent tax lien from the State Revenue Department. There were multiple notices of impending foreclosure on his two largest flagship properties. I leaned slightly closer, taking in the dates and the staggering financial figures printed on the collection letters. I did the math in my head instantly. Trey was bleeding capital from every single direction. His corporate bank accounts were heavily overdrawn, and his credit lines were entirely frozen by aggressive debt collectors. I looked back up at Trey, taking in his sweating forehead, his dilated pupils, and his slightly shaking hands. The arrogant facade was just a desperately thin mask covering total financial devastation. The massive $500,000 wire transfer from my trust fund had not touched a single one of these crushing debts. If he had actually received the money, he would have paid off these immediate foreclosure notices to save his public image. The money never went to him. It never went into his failing real estate business to secure the family legacy like my parents had claimed. Trey was completely and entirely bankrupt. The $500,000 did not save him. He was standing in a leased office he could no longer afford, bragging about a theft he did not even benefit from. He had committed a federal felony for nothing. I did not waste another second looking at my brother. I turned on my heel and walked out of his lavish, desperately leased corner office. Trey was still shouting behind me, still bragging about his invincibility and our parents' undying loyalty, but his voice was just meaningless noise fading into the background. I strode through the marble lobby and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. My mind was already leagues ahead of him, racing through the implications of his impending bankruptcy. If the $500,000 did not go towards saving his failing real estate empire, then Trey was completely ignorant of its actual location. He had forged a federal document and handed the loaded gun directly to someone else. I drove back to my apartment with surgical focus. I walked straight to my home office and sat back down in front of my glowing monitor array. I ignored the domestic layers of the fraud entirely and directed my complete attention to the offshore accounts. The money had settled into a Cayman Islands account controlled by a French limited liability company named L'Avenir Holdings. I needed to know exactly who was sitting at the top of that corporate structure. I deployed a secondary tracing algorithm designed to scrape European corporate registries and cross-border business directories. The French financial database is highly regulated, but as a corporate forensic investigator, I maintain authorized access credentials for international compliance audits. I punched in my clearance codes and pulled the incorporation documents for L'Avenir Holdings. The registered director of the holding company was not my brother Trey. It was not my mother Valerie or my father Marcus. The sole managing director was a French national named Laurent Dubois. I opened a fresh search window and ran a deep background check on Laurent Dubois. I utilized open-source intelligence databases, property records, and international social media scrapers. The profile populated almost instantly. Laurent was a handsome 34-year-old boutique hotel manager living in Nice, France. His digital footprint was filled with pictures of sailboats, expensive coastal dinners, and high-end European nightlife. He had absolutely zero professional connections to commercial real estate in the United States. He had zero ties to my family, except for one. I needed to connect Brittany to Laurent. I accessed a global aviation tracking database and ran a query on European flight manifests matching Brittany passport information. I cross-referenced those specific travel dates with her highly curated public social media timeline. The discrepancy was immediate and staggering. For the past 3 years, Brittany had posted dozens of photos, claiming she was attending exclusive wellness retreats in Sedona, luxury spa weekends in Napa Valley, and spiritual cleansing seminars in the mountains. The flight logs told the actual truth. During every single one of those fake domestic trips, Brittany was boarding first-class international flights to the south of France. I dug deeper, pulling public hotel registries and luxury villa rental records along the French Riviera. I matched the rental dates with Brittany flight manifests. Every single time she flew to Europe, a high-end coastal villa was booked under the name Laurent Dubois. The payment method for those luxurious rentals was a secondary offshore credit card registered under Brittany's maiden name. I brought up the digital security logs for L'Avenir Holdings, the IP addresses logging into that Cayman Islands bank account to check the $500,000 balance matched Laurent's location in France. However, within the last 48 hours, there were 2 massive anomaly pings. Someone had logged into the French holding account from a domestic IP address. I traced the geolocation coordinates. The login originated from the exact luxury hotel in Miami where Brittany had stayed when she purchased her $22,000 Hermes Birkin bag. The entire sickening puzzle snapped into perfect, terrifying clarity. Brittany had been carrying on a highly expensive long-term international affair with Laurent Dubois. She had watched Trey's real estate business slowly bleed out over the last 2 years. She knew the foreclosure notices were piling up and the money was rapidly running dry. Brittany had absolutely no intention of sticking around to play the supportive broke wife of a disgraced developer. She needed a massive golden parachute to fund her escape. She had masterfully manipulated Trey's financial desperation. She convinced her arrogant husband that forging the power of attorney on my trust fund would provide the capital injection he needed to save his sinking empire. She weaponized Valerie and Marcus' blind favoritism, knowing my parents would gladly break federal law to protect their precious golden boy. She let them take all the physical risk of signing the fraudulent documents. But the moment the money cleared the bank, Brittany intercepted the wire. She utilized her access to Trey accounts to instantly route the funds through the domestic shell companies and straight into the French LLC she had secretly established with her lover. The $500,000 was their permanent getaway fund. The Hermes bag was just a celebratory victory purchase on my dime. Brittany was planning to completely drain Trey dry, let him take the federal fall for the forged banking documents, and flee to the French Riviera to live off my stolen life savings. I highlighted the flight logs, the villa receipts, and the IP login coordinates. I packaged the entire mountain of undeniable digital evidence into a highly secure encrypted folder on my hard drive. I had the exact weapon I needed to destroy the illusion of their perfect marriage and send Brittany to federal prison. Right at that exact second, my cell phone screen lit up on my desk. A text message notification broke the quiet hum of the servers. It was from Brittany. She must have had an alert set up on the holding account tracking any external security pings. She knew someone was looking at her offshore money. The message was short, frantic, and dripping with venom. It read, "Drop it, or I will tell your boss you are stealing company data for personal use." I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The sheer audacity of her message was almost comical. Brittany actually thought a corporate human resources threat was going to stop a highly trained forensic accountant from pursuing a federal fraud investigation. She was attempting to play a complex game of chess with the rules of checkers. She genuinely believed she could bully me by threatening my corporate reputation. She did not realize that exposing her financial crimes was now my only priority. I typed my reply with steady fingers. "Let us talk in person. The Reserve at noon. Come alone." The Reserve was a ridiculously overpriced artisan coffee shop located right in the center of the financial district. It was exactly the kind of pretentious high society environment where Brittany felt the safest. It was a place explicitly designed for people who wanted to be seen spending money they did not actually have. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a specific corner booth with its back to the wall. I ordered a simple black espresso and waited. Brittany walked through the heavy glass doors at precisely noon. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat and oversized designer sunglasses. She carried the stolen gold Hermes Birkin bag on her forearm like a shield. She slid into the leather booth across from me, refusing to take off her sunglasses. She looked around the crowded cafe, ensuring there were enough wealthy patrons nearby to serve as an audience if she needed to stage a dramatic scene. She did not bother with pleasantries. She leaned across the small marble table, her voice a harsh, aggressive whisper. "You really think you are untouchable, Maya? You think because you know how to read a bank ledger you can destroy my life? I have friends on the executive board of your accounting firm. One phone call and your career is over." I took a slow sip of my espresso. I told her to make the call. I told her I would gladly explain to my corporate partners exactly why I was tracking a French shell company. Brittany's jaw tightened. She realized the corporate blackmail was not going to work. She shifted her tactics, immediately transitioning from aggressive threats to calculated extortion. She unclasped her designer coat and laid her hands flat on the table. "Let us be practical," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You are obsessed with this missing money. Fine. I am willing to be generous. I will wire $100,000 back into your personal account by the end of the business day. Consider it a massive favor. In exchange, you sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. You drop this entire ridiculous investigation. You delete whatever data you pulled on L. Avenir Holdings, and you let Trey take the fall for the forged trust documents." He signed the paperwork, Maya. "He is the one who committed the crime. He is going bankrupt anyway. Let him sink and you get $100,000 to walk away." I looked at her in absolute disbelief. She was actively offering to sell out her own husband to federal prison for a 20% refund on money she stole from me. She was fully prepared to let the father of her future children take the fall for a felony while she boarded a first-class flight to Nice to be with her French lover. When I did not immediately answer, Brittany leaned closer, deploying her ultimate weapon. "Do not look at me like that, Maya. Do not play the self-righteous victim. If you push this to the police, who do you think they are going to believe? Look around this cafe. Look at me. I am a beautiful white mother with a pristine social record and a flawless reputation in this city. I will sit in that police station with perfect tears in my eyes and tell them my abusive, bankrupt husband forced me to move that money into an offshore account to hide it from his creditors. I will tell them his bitter sister is harassing me out of pure spite because she is jealous of my marriage. They will take one look at you and see exactly what society expects to see. An angry, aggressive black woman throwing a loud, unhinged tantrum over money she does not even need. The system was built for me, Maya. You will lose. Take the 100 grand and walk away before you ruin your own life. I sat perfectly still. The sheer, breathtaking sociopathy of her racial gaslighting was almost impressive. She was sitting across from me, holding a luxury handbag, bought entirely with my stolen trust fund, explicitly weaponizing her whiteness and her tears to guarantee her escape to the French Riviera. She expected me to react with explosive outrage. She desperately wanted me to raise my voice, slam my hands on the marble table, and cause a massive public scene that would perfectly validate the exact racist stereotype she had just threatened me with. She wanted me to lose my composure so she could play the terrified victim. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I kept my posture relaxed and completely unbothered. I reached slowly into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. I pulled out a sleek digital audio recorder. A tiny red light pulsed steadily on the top, indicating it had been actively capturing every single word spoken since she sat down. I placed the recorder gently on the marble table right next to her stolen $22,000 handbag. Brittany stared at the red light, her confident smirk instantly vanishing. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and hollow beneath her oversized sunglasses. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. My voice was calm, cold, and surgically precise. I do not make deals with thieves, I stated simply. And I certainly do not negotiate with criminals who try to use my race as a bargaining chip. You just explicitly admitted to intercepting a fraudulent wire transfer and conspiring to frame your husband for federal fraud on tape. Your pristine social record is not going to save you from a federal indictment, Brittany. She lunged for the recorder, her manicured hands shaking violently. I snatched it off the table before her fingers could even graze the metal casing and slipped it safely back into my blazer pocket. I stood up slowly from the leather booth, looking down at the terrified woman who genuinely thought she was a criminal mastermind just 5 minutes ago. I turned my back on her without another word and walked calmly out of the coffee shop, leaving her sitting completely alone, paralyzed by the weight of her own recorded confession. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air and pulled out my cell phone. The ambient noise of the city rushed over me, but my focus remained absolute. I did not call the local police department yet. The authorities could wait. I opened my encrypted email client and created a new message directed straight to Trey's personal private inbox. I did not write a subject line. I did not include a single word of text or explanation. I simply attached a high-resolution photograph of Laurent Dubois standing on the balcony of the luxury French villa, holding a glass of champagne smiling at the camera. I hit send. The golden boy was about to find out exactly what his perfect wife had done with his stolen money. I hit send and watched the delivery notification clear my encrypted outbox. The digital footprint was completely untraceable, but the impact would be utterly devastating. I did not have to wait long for the blast wave to hit. I tracked the read receipt on my server. Trey opened the email exactly 4 minutes after it was delivered to his secure inbox. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and watched the live network monitors. My digital tripwires began pinging wildly across my secondary screen. Trey was frantically attempting to log into the holding company portal. He was desperately slamming in passwords trying to initiate emergency wire reversals that were completely impossible to execute. The money was permanently gone. The illusion was dead. 30 minutes later, my cell phone began vibrating endlessly on my desk. I ignored the calls, but the text messages flooded my screen. They were from Valerie. The texts were a chaotic stream of entirely capitalized letters and terrified misspellings. She demanded to know what I had sent to her son. According to her panicked digital confession, Trey had sped home from his leased office to confront his wife. Marcus and Valerie had rushed over to the McMansion to intervene in the escalating disaster. They arrived just in time to watch the absolute implosion of the Golden Boy. Brittany was not begging for forgiveness. She was standing in the grand marble foyer with 4 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases packed and ready for a private car to the airport. She had the stolen Hermes Birkin bag securely on her arm. She calmly informed my weeping parents that the offshore accounts were locked under Laurent corporate signature. She laughed in Trey's face, told him he was a pathetic failure, and walked out the front door. The perfect white daughter-in-law they had protected by committing federal wire fraud had just robbed them blind. 2 hours later, the violent hammering started on my apartment door. It was the frantic, desperate pounding of people who had run out of options. I checked the security camera. Marcus and Valerie were standing in my hallway. They looked completely destroyed. My father's tailored suit was wrinkled, and his shoulders were slumped. My mother's makeup was smeared down her face in dark, jagged tracks. I unlocked the heavy oak door and pulled it open, but I stayed firmly planted in the threshold, blocking their entry. Valerie immediately collapsed into a pathetic theatrical sob. She reached out trying to grab my blazer, but I stepped back sharply. "Maya, you have to help us," she wailed, her voice cracking with genuine terror. "Brittany is a monster. She manipulated all of us. She stole the money and left Trey with nothing. You have to stop this investigation. The bank is flagging the routing numbers and Richard Vance dropped us as clients. We have no legal representation. If you do not delete those files, Trey is going to federal prison. You cannot let them lock your brother in a cage." I stared at the woman who had slapped me across the face just days ago. I looked at the man who had tried to force me into a psychiatric conservatorship to steal my remaining wealth. They were not feeling remorse for their crime. They were only crying because their accomplice had outsmarted them. "I am a forensic accountant," I stated, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any sympathy. "I do not erase crimes. You forged a federal document. You stole my life savings to fund a failing business. Trey is going to prison because he committed wire fraud. You are all going to face the federal consequences of your own greed. I am not lifting a single finger to save you." The tears instantly vanished from my father's face. The desperate, broken patriarch was replaced by a vicious, cornered predator. He stepped in front of Valerie, closing the distance between us. His face flushed with pure malice. "You think you hold all the cards," Marcus growled, his voice dropping to a dangerous, aggressive timbre. "You think you can just watch us burn. You forgot about your godmother, Helene." He leaned closer, his eyes narrowed into dark slits. "She lives in that rent-controlled duplex in the historic district, the property my holding company has owned for 20 years. She relies on that fixed rent because her pension barely covers her medical bills." I felt a sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest, but I kept my expression entirely blank. Godmother Helene had practically raised me when my parents were obsessing over Trey. She was the only real family I had left in this world. Marcus smiled a cruel, jagged smile. "You are going to log onto your computer right now and erase every trace of that offshore investigation. You will sign an affidavit stating you authorized that transfer as a loan. If you do not comply, I will terminate Helene's lease by the end of the business day. I will send my property managers over tomorrow morning and throw all of her belongings out on the curb. If we go down, she is on the street tomorrow. Make your choice." I did not flinch. I looked Marcus directly in his cold, calculating eyes and slammed the heavy oak door squarely in his face. I threw the deadbolt and engaged the heavy chain lock. Muffled shouting echoed from the hallway, but I was already moving. Marcus was a ruthless landlord, and he operated entirely outside the boundaries of the law when he felt cornered. I knew exactly how his property management company worked. They would not bother with a legal 30-day eviction notice. They would show up at dawn, change the locks, drag Helene's belongings onto the sidewalk, and force her to fight a lengthy, expensive battle in civil court just to get her winter coats back. I was not going to let that happen. Helene was the woman who had packed my lunches when Valerie was too busy attending country club luncheons. She was the one who attended my college graduation when my father was busy celebrating Trey acquiring his first leased sports car. I grabbed my keys, my laptop bag, and my secure physical authenticator token. I slipped out the service elevator to avoid my parents in the lobby and sprinted to my car. I sat in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and opened my secure financial terminal on my tablet. Marcus thought the stolen $500,000 was the extent of my wealth. He genuinely believed that because I lived in a modest apartment and drove a reliable hybrid, I was financially vulnerable. He was completely wrong. I had spent a decade conducting high-level forensic audits for Fortune 500 companies. I had built a massive portfolio of legitimate diversified investments. I accessed my primary brokerage account and bypassed the standard withdrawal protocols. I executed an emergency liquidation of my blue-chip stocks and high-yield mutual funds, taking the early withdrawal penalties without a second thought. I needed raw liquid cash, and I needed it immediately. Next, I pulled up my contacts and called Jonathan Sterling. Jonathan was a luxury real estate broker I had saved from a devastating IRS audit 3 years ago. He owed me a massive professional favor, and I was calling it in. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I needed a premium ground floor condo in the safest gated community in the city. It had to be fully furnished, move-in ready, and ADA compliant. I told him I was paying entirely in cash and we were closing the transaction in under 4 hours. Jonathan hesitated for exactly 1 second before his professional instincts took over. He told me he had a pocket listing in the West End overlooking the botanical gardens. An elderly client had recently moved to an assisted living facility, leaving behind a pristine, fully furnished unit. The asking price was $800,000. I told him to draft the paperwork and send me the wire routing numbers. I authorized the wire transfer from the driver's seat of my car, watching the massive sum leave my account. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I was buying a fortress for the only mother figure I had ever known. Once the escrow confirmation pinged my inbox, I threw the car into drive and sped toward the historic district. The sky was darkening by the time I pulled onto Helene quiet tree-lined street. I saw the threat immediately. A white commercial van with Marcus Property Management logo was parked illegally directly across from her duplex. Two large men in heavy work jackets were sitting in the front cab smoking cigarettes and watching her front door. They were waiting for the morning to execute the illegal lockout. I parked my car blocking their van entirely. I stepped out and glared at the driver, memorizing his license plate. I walked up to Helene's front porch and tore the fraudulent neon green eviction notice off the wood. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warm, familiar smell of cinnamon and old paper washing over me. Helene was sitting in her worn floral armchair, calmly drinking a cup of tea. She looked up and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She did not look afraid. She looked deeply disappointed. "Marcus called me an hour ago," Helene said, her voice steady and smooth. "He told me I had until sunrise to vacate." He sounded like a panicked little boy throwing a temper tantrum. I knelt beside her chair and took her fragile hands in mine. I told her she was leaving right now. I explained about the new condo in the West End, the gated security, and the breathtaking view of the gardens. I told her the deed was already in her name, and Marcus would never be able to touch her or threaten her housing ever again. Helene squeezed my hands tightly, a proud glimmer shining in her dark eyes. She did not argue. She simply nodded and stood up. "We do not need to pack the furniture," she said smoothly. "Just the essentials and the memories." I grabbed some heavy canvas bags from the hall closet and began packing her vintage photo albums, her jewelry, and her favorite quilt. The property goons outside were powerless to stop a voluntary move. As I was clearing out the bottom drawer of her heavy oak writing desk, Helene walked into the room carrying a small, ornate iron key. She knelt beside the floorboards near the radiator and pulled up a loose plank of wood. She reached into the dark cavity and pulled out a heavy, dust-covered metal lockbox. She stood up and placed the heavy box directly into my hands. The metal was cold and covered in decades of grime. I looked at her in confusion. Helene met my gaze with absolute fierce clarity. "Your grandfather knew your parents were greedy," she whispered softly. "He left a fail-safe." I took the heavy metal lockbox from Helene and carried it to the small kitchen table. The iron key turned with a harsh metallic snap. I pushed the lid open, and a wave of stale air washed over my face. Inside were stacks of yellowed legal paper bound together by brittle rubber bands. There were old bank ledgers, handwritten notes, and a single sealed envelope resting on top. The front of the envelope bore my name written in my grandfather's sharp, angular handwriting. I carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick parchment inside. My eyes scanned the ink. My grandfather had not written a sentimental goodbye. He had written a tactical briefing. He stated clearly that he had watched Marcus and Valerie raise Trey to be an entitled parasite. He knew they worshipped status, and he knew they viewed my independence as a threat. He predicted with terrifying accuracy that the moment Trey bankrupted his own future, my parents would attempt to cannibalize my trust fund to save him. He had deliberately allowed them to think they held the administrative keys to the accounts, but he had built a hidden trapdoor directly into the foundation of the trust itself. I set the letter down and pulled the bound legal documents from the box. As a forensic accountant, I have dissected thousands of complex financial contracts, but the sheer brilliance of what my grandfather had engineered left me speechless. I spread the original unmodified trust declaration across Helene's kitchen table. I bypassed the standard disbursement schedules and flipped directly to the penalty addendums hidden deep within the final pages. There it was highlighted by a faded yellow sticky note. It was a highly specific, irrevocably binding fraud clause. The legal language was absolute and ironclad. If any family member acting as a trustee or executor attempted to misappropriate, forge, or illegally alter the disbursement of the funds, an immediate collateral forfeiture was triggered. I read the asset forfeiture list 3 times just to be absolutely certain I was not misinterpreting the legal jargon. My grandfather had not just instituted a financial penalty, he had explicitly tied the collateral clause directly to my parents' primary real estate holdings. If Marcus or Valerie facilitated fraud against my trust, they automatically surrendered their legal claim to their sprawling Connecticut mansion. The property would be immediately seized and liquidated to repay the stolen funds with punitive interest. They had blindly signed the original trust documents 2 decades ago without ever bothering to read the penalty clauses on the final page. They thought they were untouchable because they controlled the paper trail. They had no idea they had literally signed away the deed to their own home the second they forged my name on that wire transfer. I looked up from the documents and met Helene's steady gaze. She was watching me with a quiet, knowing smile. She knew exactly what was in that box, and she had waited patiently for the exact right moment to hand me the weapon. I carefully packed the original documents back into the metal box and locked it tight. Marcus thought he had me backed into a corner. He genuinely believed his cruel threat to evict an elderly woman would force me to erase Trey felony and sign away my life savings. He thought I was spending the next 24 hours crying and scrambling to draft a fake loan affidavit. He did not know Helene was already packing her bags to move into a luxury condo. He did not know his bluff was entirely worthless, and he certainly did not know I was currently holding the legal authority to seize his multi-million-dollar estate. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my retained corporate attorney. She was the most ruthless litigator in the city, and she owed me for uncovering a massive embezzlement scheme at her previous firm. I did not bother checking the time. When she answered, I told her I was sending over a highly sensitive digital scan of a legacy trust document. I instructed her to review the fraud clause and immediately draft the asset seizure filings. I told her I wanted the legal paperwork locked and loaded to file with the federal court the absolute second I gave the command. She read the clause while I waited on the line. She let out a sharp, impressed laugh and told me my parents had essentially handed me the deed to their house on a silver platter. I hung up the phone and helped Helene finish packing her canvas bags. We carried her belongings out to my car, leaving the fraudulent eviction notice sitting alone on the empty kitchen counter. The next morning, I successfully moved Helene into the secure gated community. I hired a private security firm to monitor the condo and ensure Marcus property management goons could never get within 10 miles of her front door. She was completely safe, entirely shielded from my parents' toxic retaliation. With Helene secured, I drove back to my apartment and checked my mail. My parents were completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial ruin accelerating toward them. They were so incredibly confident in their extortion scheme that they had returned to business as usual. They genuinely believed I had surrendered to their threats. They thought Trey was safe. Brittany was just a minor setback they could sweep under the rug, and their pristine social image was completely secure. Lying at the top of my mail stack was a thick cream-colored envelope stamped with gold foil. I sliced it open and pulled out a heavy cardstock invitation. Marcus and Valerie were hosting their lavish 40th wedding anniversary gala. They had rented out the main ballroom at the elite city country club. It was going to be a massive performative event, packed with their wealthy friends, local politicians, and elite business partners. They actually had the sheer arrogant audacity to mail me an invitation to watch them celebrate their perfect marriage. They wanted me to sit in the corner and applaud them while they actively covered up my stolen money. I held the heavy cardstock between my fingers, tracing the embossed gold lettering. They wanted a show. They wanted a public display of family unity to mask the rotting foundation of their actual lives. My parents were so completely consumed by their desperate need for societal approval that they were willing to throw a massive party while their son was actively spiraling into bankruptcy and their daughter-in-law was fleeing the country with stolen money. They actually thought sending me an invitation was a power move. They thought it was a stark reminder of my place in the family hierarchy, a quiet demand that I show up, shut my mouth, and applaud their fake perfection. I did not tear the invitation in half. I did not throw it in the trash. I set it carefully on my desk right next to my glowing monitors. It was no longer just an invitation to a party. It was a deadline. I booted up my primary encrypted server. It was time to build the execution block. I spent the next 6 hours operating in a state of absolute cold detachment. I was no longer a betrayed sister or an unloved daughter. I was a senior forensic investigator, dissecting a hostile corporate entity. I created a master directory on my desktop and labeled it with Trey Offshore Shell Company. I started with the domestic fraud. I dragged and dropped the forged power of attorney into the first folder. I pulled high-resolution digital scans of Marcus and Valerie's signatures from their public business filings and ran a comparative biometric overlay against the signatures on the banking release forms. The match was perfect. I documented the exact timestamps proving my parents had physically witnessed and signed the fraudulent transfer authorizations. They were legally complicit in a federal felony, and I had the mathematical proof locked in a secure PDF. Next, I opened the offshore tracking file. I compiled the swift wire routing numbers that moved my $500,000 from my domestic trust into the Cayman Islands. I attached the IP geo-tracking logs proving Brittany had accessed the L. Avenir Holdings account from a Miami hotel room. I dropped in the European flight manifests showing her frequent first-class trips to Nice. I pulled the digital receipts from her $22,000 Hermes Birkin bag purchase referencing the transaction timestamps with the exact moment my trust fund was drained. Finally, I added the high-resolution photograph of Laurent Dubois raising a champagne glass on the balcony of his rented French Riviera villa. The narrative was undeniable. Trey had stolen the money to save his bankrupt real estate firm, and his wife had masterfully manipulated him, intercepting the capital to fund her international affair. The third folder was the most devastating piece of the puzzle. I uploaded the pristine scans of my grandfather's original trust documents. I highlighted the fraud clause in bright red digital ink. I attached the asset seizure filings my corporate attorney had just finished drafting. The legal paperwork explicitly targeted Marcus and Valerie primary residence. The multi-million-dollar estate where they planned to host their post-gala brunch was already locked in the crosshairs of a civil forfeiture lawsuit. They had signed away the deed to their own home the second they helped Trey forge my name. I stared at the compiled directory. My parents believed they could control this situation by threatening my godmother and manipulating family loyalty. They thought this was just a domestic dispute over money that could be swept under the rug with enough bullying. They fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of the real world. You do not steal $500,000 across international borders without triggering massive federal tripwires. Family justice was no longer sufficient. Federal crimes require federal consequences. I opened a secure encrypted browser over a virtual private network, bouncing my connection through 3 different offshore servers to ensure absolute anonymity. I navigated to the digital whistleblower portal for the FBI Financial Crimes Division. I did not write an emotional plea. I did not mention that Trey was my brother or that Marcus and Valerie were my parents. I wrote a sterile, highly technical briefing that read exactly like a corporate compliance audit. I outlined the violation of Title 18 United States Code Section 1343, detailing the wire fraud, the forged signatures, and the offshore tax evasion. I mapped the exact flow of illicit capital from a domestic trust into an unregistered foreign entity. I provided the bank routing numbers, the IP addresses, and the corporate registry files for the French shell company. I handed the federal government a perfectly wrapped, bow-tied package of irrefutable evidence. A federal prosecutor would not even have to work for it. A first-year intern could secure a search warrant and an asset freeze with the data I was uploading. I hit submit. The progress bar flashed green, and the entire directory vanished into the federal database. There was no going back. I had just initiated a chain reaction that would inevitably result in federal agents knocking on Trey's door. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly, but they crush everything in their path. My parents were completely oblivious to the federal anvil hanging directly over their heads. They were busy booking high-end caterers, selecting vintage wines, and ordering elaborate floral arrangements for a country club ballroom. I turned my attention back to the physical desk. I picked up the cream-colored RSVP card that had fallen from the anniversary invitation. It requested a response by the end of the week. I picked up a heavy black fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I checked the box next to joyfully accepts. I did not add a +1. I did not write a sentimental note of congratulations. I simply signed my name in sharp dark ink. I slid the card into the pre-stamped return envelope and sealed it shut. I was going to the City Country Club. I was going to walk into that ballroom wearing a designer gown and watch my family burn their own legacy to the ground. The night of the 40th anniversary gala arrived with a bitter winter chill that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside the City Country Club. The venue was a monument to old money and carefully guarded exclusivity. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of imported luxury sedans and armored black SUVs. I sat in the back of my hired town car and watched the elite of the city file into the grand foyer. There were state senators, local judges, corporate executives, and members of the old guard who had spent decades insulating my parents from the consequences of their arrogance. They were all walking blindly into a meticulously constructed illusion. Marcus and Valerie had spared absolutely no expense to project an image of untouchable financial supremacy. Massive arches of imported white orchids framed the entrance. A string quartet played softly in the background. The champagne flowing from the crystal towers cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week. I stepped out of the car and the frigid air hit my bare shoulders. I was not wearing my usual conservative corporate blazer and slacks. I had commissioned a breathtaking custom gown from an independent designer in Milan. It was spun from deep midnight blue silk, structured with sharp, angular lines that moved like liquid glass when I walked. It was a dress designed for a conqueror, not a subdued, compliant daughter. I handed my coat to the stunned attendant and walked through the heavy mahogany double doors. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds and tailored tuxedos. The noise was a steady hum of wealthy networking and clinking crystal. I paused at the top of the grand marble staircase that overlooked the main floor. It took exactly 30 seconds for the first person to notice me. My Aunt Patricia froze mid-sentence, her champagne glass hovering near her mouth. She nudged her husband and pointed. The reaction spread across the room like a localized seismic event. The polite networking chatter died down, replaced by a fierce, aggressive wave of frantic whispers. Eyes darted in my direction. I was the estranged daughter, the ungrateful pariah who had supposedly abandoned her family. My presence was a direct assault on the perfect narrative my parents had spun for years. I kept my posture entirely rigid, my face completely devoid of emotion, and descended the marble steps. I did not make it past the ice sculpture centerpiece before my parents intercepted me. Marcus and Valerie moved through the crowd with terrifying speed, their practiced smiles locked tightly in place for the benefit of their wealthy guests. Up close, however, their eyes were wide with genuine panic and absolute venom. Valerie wore a heavily beaded silver gown that looked like a suit of armor. Marcus was in a custom tuxedo, his face flushed a dangerous shade of red. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin, but I did not flinch. I simply looked down at his hand until he realized the mayor was watching us and slowly let go. "What the hell are you doing here?" Marcus hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, guttural whisper. "You are not welcome in this room. You are not going to ruin the most important night of our lives with your pathetic, dramatic tantrums." Valerie stepped closer, blocking the view of the nearest table. She smiled brightly for the crowd while her words dripped with pure acid. "We told everyone you were overseas on a minor auditing assignment," she whispered frantically. "You are going to turn around, walk back out those doors, and get into a taxi before Trey arrives. We will not allow you to embarrass your brother. We will not allow you to stand here and judge us." I looked at the two people who had forged my signature to steal my life savings. They were not worried about their crimes. They were only worried about their social standing. I told them I had mailed my RSVP card, and I was simply attending a family function. Marcus sneered, his face twisting into an ugly mask of superiority. "You think you can just force your way into high society," he growled. "You are nothing but a petty accountant, Maya. You do not belong with these people. You are a complete embarrassment." He turned his head and sharply snapped his fingers at the head of the country club security detail. A massive man with the earpiece immediately marched over, flanked by two large guards. Marcus pointed directly at my chest. "This woman is trespassing," he told the security chief, his voice carrying enough authority to turn heads at the neighboring tables. "She is not on the approved guest list. I want her physically removed from the premises immediately. Use whatever force is necessary, but get her out of my sight." The security chief stepped forward, his hand reaching out to grab my shoulder. I did not step back. I calmly reached into my metallic clutch and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the screen and opened a heavily encrypted legal document. I held the bright screen up directly in front of the security chief's face. I told him to look very closely at the signature block at the bottom of the digital contract. The chief squinted at the screen, and his entire demeanor instantly changed. His hand dropped to his side. The aggressive posture vanished, replaced by absolute terrified confusion. He looked from my phone to Marcus, and then back to me. Marcus let out a loud, exasperated breath. "What are you waiting for?" Marcus demanded loudly, drawing even more attention. "I pay a fortune for club membership. Throw her out right now." The security chief cleared his throat and took a very deliberate step away from me. "I am incredibly sorry, Mr. Wilson," the chief said, his voice wavering slightly. "I cannot remove this woman from the ballroom." Marcus' face went completely purple. "What are you talking about?" he yelled, losing his grip on his carefully maintained volume control. "I am hosting this gala. I rented this entire facility." I locked my phone and dropped it back into my clutch. I looked at my father with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. "You rented the facility 2 months ago," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the sudden silence of the room. "But you failed to pay the final catering and venue invoice yesterday because your domestic accounts are currently frozen under a federal investigation hold. The club manager was going to cancel your gala this morning." I stepped closer to my father, watching his arrogant expression shatter into pure horror, so I stepped in. "I legally bought out the entire catering and venue contract through my corporate agency. I paid in full in cash." "You are not hosting this event, Marcus." "I am." I smiled a sharp, flawless smile. "I own this room tonight, and I am not going anywhere." The security chief nodded respectfully to me and took a deliberate step backward. He looked at my father with a firm, uncompromising expression and stated that his team worked for the venue, and the venue was currently under my legal jurisdiction. He respectfully suggested that Marcus return to his table to avoid any unnecessary disturbances. Marcus' jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. He stared at me with an intense, suffocating hatred, but he was entirely trapped. He could not throw a violent tantrum in front of the local judges and state senators sipping champagne just 30 feet away. Valerie grabbed his arm, her silver-beaded gown rustling sharply, and practically dragged him toward the head table. They had to maintain the illusion at all costs. The evening progressed with an agonizingly slow and opulent rhythm. The catering staff moved gracefully through the grand ballroom, serving a 5-course meal featuring seared scallops, truffle risotto, and roasted duck. The irony was absolutely exquisite. My parents were sitting at the center of the room, graciously accepting compliments for a lavish feast that I was actively paying for. I sat at a small table near the back, sipping sparkling water and observing the tragic comedy unfolding before me. My eyes locked onto the head table. Trey was sitting rigidly in his chair, looking completely hollowed out. His tailored tuxedo hung loosely on his shoulders, and he spent the entire meal staring blankly at his untouched plate. Sitting directly beside him was Brittany. She was supposed to be halfway across the Atlantic Ocean sipping espresso on the French Riviera. Instead, she was sitting in a Connecticut country club, sweating profusely under the warm amber chandeliers. My anonymous tip to the federal authorities had worked faster than I could have ever anticipated. The FBI Financial Crimes Division had flagged the L'Avenir offshore accounts that morning. When Brittany tried to board her private flight to Nice, her passport was flagged and her digital assets were instantly frozen. She could not run and she could not hide. Marcus had undoubtedly threatened her with total annihilation if she did not show up tonight to play the role of the devoted wife. He needed the local politicians to see his perfect family. Brittany sat there dabbing her forehead with a linen napkin, her eyes darting nervously toward the ballroom doors every time a waiter walked past. She knew the federal indictments were coming and the sheer terror was radiating from her pores. As the catering staff began clearing the dinner plates and pouring the vintage champagne, the room lights dimmed. A bright spotlight illuminated the main stage. Marcus stood up from his chair, buttoned his tuxedo jacket, and walked confidently up the steps. The string quartet faded into silence. The wealthy elite of the city turned their attention to the patriarch of the Wilson family. Marcus tapped the crystal microphone, testing the sound. He looked out over the sea of faces and smiled his most charming, authoritative smile. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," he began, his voice echoing smoothly through the massive ballroom. 40 years ago, Valerie and I made a promise to build something lasting. We wanted to build a legacy grounded in integrity, hard work, and absolute family loyalty. I listened to the words dripping from his mouth and felt a cold wave of disgust. He was standing in front of his peers, preaching about integrity while actively covering up federal wire fraud. He was boasting about hard work while his own son was entirely bankrupt and relying on stolen funds to survive. "Look at what we have accomplished," Marcus continued, gesturing broadly toward his table. "We have built a business empire from the ground up. But our greatest achievement will always be our family." He pointed directly at Trey and Brittany. The crowd clapped politely. "Look at my son Trey and his beautiful wife Brittany. They are the shining future of the Wilson legacy. They represent the next generation of wealth built on trust and mutual respect. I am so incredibly proud of the man my son has become." Trey gave a weak, pathetic wave to the crowd. Brittany forced a smile that looked more like a painful grimace. A visible bead of sweat rolled down her temple. She was desperately gripping her champagne flute to hide her shaking hands. Marcus finished his grand speech with a toast to his own brilliance, and the crowd applauded enthusiastically. He handed the microphone to Valerie. My mother stepped forward, the silver beads of her gown catching the bright stage lights. She looked out at the audience with a carefully constructed expression of deep maternal warmth. She waited for absolute silence before she spoke. "We are so blessed to share this milestone with our closest friends," Valerie said, her voice projecting a soft, theatrical vulnerability. "Family is everything to us. And family means standing together even when times are difficult. Family means offering grace when someone loses their way." Her eyes scanned the dark room and locked directly onto me. The spotlight operator, following her gaze, immediately swung a harsh, bright beam of light straight onto my table. Hundreds of faces turned in their chairs to stare at me. I was suddenly illuminated in the center of the ballroom wearing my midnight blue silk gown, perfectly calm and entirely exposed. Valerie gripped the microphone tightly. "We want to take a moment to publicly acknowledge our daughter Maya," she announced, her voice echoing with fake sympathy. "Maya has faced some severe personal challenges lately, but we want everyone here to know that our love is unconditional. We forgive our daughter Maya for her recent struggles, and we welcome her back into the fold with open arms. We will always protect our own." A collective murmur of approval swept through the wealthy crowd. They looked at me with pity. Valerie had just masterfully attempted to rewrite reality. She was publicly painting me as a damaged, unstable failure who was finally crawling back to her generous, forgiving parents. She thought this public manipulation would force me to lower my head and accept my place as the grateful subordinate. She thought the social pressure of the room would break me. I looked at Valerie standing on the stage, radiating false piety. I looked at Marcus standing beside her, glowing with arrogant triumph. I looked at Brittany, sweating in terror, and Trey drowning in his own incompetence. I smiled. I stood up from my chair and picked up my crystal champagne glass. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the rustle of my silk gown as I stepped away from the table. I did not run out the door in tears. I walked directly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I maintained perfect eye contact with my mother as I approached the stage. I climbed the 4 carpeted steps, moving with the calm, deliberate grace of an executioner. I walked straight up to Valerie and held out my empty hand. I did not ask. I simply waited. Valerie's hands trembled as she slowly surrendered the microphone. I gripped the cool metal of the microphone. The ambient noise in the massive ballroom evaporated into a suffocating silence. Hundreds of elite guests, wealthy investors, and local politicians stared up at the stage, expecting a tearful speech of gratitude and familial redemption. Marcus took a threatening step forward, his jaw clenched tightly, but I raised my hand, halting him in his tracks. I pulled my smartphone from my clutch and swiped my thumb across the screen. I tapped a single button synced directly to the country club audiovisual system. The heavy velvet curtains behind the stage parted mechanically. 3 massive high-definition projector screens blinked to life, illuminating the entire ballroom in a harsh blue glow. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. They were expecting a heartwarming slideshow of Marcus and Valerie over their 40 years of marriage. They were expecting baby pictures of Trey and perfectly curated vacation photos from their summers in the Hamptons. The center screen displayed a stark black and white legal document. It was the forged power of attorney. "My parents just spoke to you about family values and building a legacy," I began, my voice ringing through the pristine acoustics of the ballroom, perfectly calm and entirely devoid of emotion. They spoke about integrity and standing together when times are difficult. Let us take a closer look at the actual foundation of the Wilson family legacy. I clicked a button on my phone, and a bright red circle appeared on the massive screen, highlighting the signature block at the bottom of the document. 2 days ago, my brother Trey completely bankrupted his commercial real estate firm, I announced, pacing slowly across the stage. He hid his catastrophic financial failures from his investors, from his wife, and from his family until the absolute last possible second. When his creditors finally came to collect, he panicked. He needed $500,000 in raw liquid cash immediately to avoid facing criminal embezzlement charges. So he turned to the people who have spent his entire life shielding him from the consequences of his own incompetence. Marcus lunged forward, his face contorted in absolute rage. "Turn that screen off," he bellowed, his voice cracking over the microphone feedback. "Security, cut the power to the stage right now." The security guards standing near the ballroom exits did not move a single muscle. I was their employer for the evening, and they were strictly following my explicit instructions. My parents did not have $500,000 in liquid cash to save their golden boy. I continued smoothly, raising my voice to overpower Marcus' frantic shouting. But they knew I did. I spent the last 10 years working as a senior forensic auditor. I built a legitimate portfolio while they funded Trey's lavish lifestyle. So rather than holding their son accountable, Marcus and Valerie decided to simply steal my life savings. I tapped my phone again. The screens transitioned flawlessly. The left screen displayed the domestic bank transfer logs. The right screen showed the L. Avenir Holdings offshore corporate registry. The center screen displayed the official FBI metadata tracking logs I had compiled. The audience sat completely paralyzed. State senators and corporate executives were staring at federal crime evidence being broadcast in 10-foot-tall high-definition letters. The clinking of silverware had stopped entirely. "You are looking at a forged federal wire transfer." I narrated, my tone clinical and precise. "You are looking at the exact routing numbers that moved $500,000 from my domestic trust account directly into an unregistered shell company in the Cayman Islands. If you look at the witness signatures on the original document, you will see Marcus and Valerie Wilson. They willfully and knowingly facilitated a federal wire fraud to steal my money and protect their son." Valerie let out a loud theatrical sob and covered her face with her hands. She collapsed against the podium, but no one rushed to comfort her. The wealthy elites sitting at the front tables were already physically leaning away from the stage. They were realizing with horrifying clarity that they were drinking champagne with federal criminals. In their world, the only thing worse than losing your money is associating with someone currently under investigation by the FBI. Trey was sitting rigidly at the head table. His face was the color of wet ash. He was staring at the floor, completely unable to meet the eyes of his former business partners sitting just 10 feet away. My father threatened to evict my elderly godmother and throw her out onto the street if I did not help them cover up this felony, I stated, the cold truth echoing off the crystal chandeliers. They expected me to fall in line and protect the Wilson name. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not erase crimes, I document them. I track the IP logs, I verify the signatures, and I submitted this exact data package to the FBI Financial Crimes Division this afternoon. The ballroom erupted into panicked whispers. Several men in the back of the room immediately stood up and began walking briskly toward the coat check. No one wanted to be photographed at a gala hosted by targets of a federal indictment. Marcus stood completely frozen. The vicious cornered predator who had threatened me in my apartment hallway was entirely gone. He was just a pathetic, broken old man watching his carefully constructed empire evaporate into thin air. He looked at the giant screens displaying his own signature on the fraudulent paperwork and realized his entire life was over. "But the absolute tragedy of this entire criminal conspiracy," I said, my voice dropping slightly, commanding the full attention of the room once again, "is that the stolen money never even reached Trey creditors." I looked down at the head table. Brittany was clutching the edge of the linen tablecloth, her knuckles stark white. She was visibly trembling, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "Trey trusted his beautiful, devoted wife to execute the offshore transfer," I explained, walking to the very edge of the stage and looking directly down at my brother. "He trusted her to route the stolen funds to his domestic business accounts. But Brittany had a very different plan for the Wilson family money." I pressed the button on my smartphone one final time. The complex financial spreadsheets vanished from the 3 massive projector screens. They were instantly replaced by a single brilliant high-definition photograph. It was a crystal-clear shot taken from the deck of a luxury yacht in the French Riviera. The bright Mediterranean sun illuminated the two figures perfectly. It was Brittany wearing designer sunglasses and holding a glass of champagne, wrapping her arms around Laurent Dubois and kissing him passionately. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom lasted for exactly 2 seconds before the entire room violently imploded. A collective gasp tore through the crowd, followed instantly by an eruption of chaotic shouting. The massive 10-foot-tall image of Brittany, entangled with her French lover, burned brightly above the stage, serving as an inescapable monument to Trey's pathetic reality. I watched my brother, perfectly manicured illusion, violently shatter. Trey stood up so fast his heavy dining chair crashed backward onto the polished hardwood. The hollow, defeated shell of a man vanished, replaced entirely by pure, unhinged rage. He let out a raw, guttural scream, that echoed over the panicked murmurs of the guests. He lunged across the head table, his hands completely disregarding the crystal centerpieces and silver platters. He grabbed the heavy linen tablecloth and yanked it hard, sending a cascade of expensive catering champagne flutes and hot duck fat crashing to the floor. Brittany shrieked. The cool, calculating woman who had mocked my parents in their own foyer was completely gone. She was backed into a corner and surrounded by the very society she had desperately tried to impress. She spun around wildly, her eyes wide with absolute terror. She grabbed the heavy silk skirts of her beaded gown and scrambled toward the side exit. But panic and 6-inch designer stilettos are a disastrous combination on a slick ballroom floor. She made it exactly 4 steps before her heel caught the edge of a spilled wine puddle. Her ankle buckled sharply. Brittany went down hard. She hit the floor with a heavy, sickening thud, her expensive Hermes clutch skidding across the room and spilling her lipsticks and credit cards everywhere. She scrambled on her hands and knees, desperately trying to stand back up, but her ankle was completely useless. She was trapped on the floor, weeping hysterically while Trey continued to scream obscenities at her from across the shattered table. On the stage, Valerie finally reached her breaking point. The reality of her total social annihilation hit her all at once. She realized every state senator, local judge, and country club elite in the room was currently watching her family degrade into a violent reality television spectacle. She let out a piercing, high-pitched wail, clutched her chest theatrically, and collapsed. She crumpled onto the stage in a heap of silver beads. This time it was not a calculated manipulation. She had genuinely fainted from the sheer force of her own public humiliation. Marcus did not even look down at his unconscious wife. His priority was not his family. His priority was the massive, incriminating photograph still burning brightly on the 3 projector screens. He charged off the stage and sprinted directly toward the audiovisual booth set up in the back corner of the room. He shoved a waiter out of his path and slammed his fists onto the tech console. "Turn it off!" Marcus roared, spit flying from his lips as he grabbed the young audio technician by the collar of his uniform. "Shut the screens down right now, or I will personally destroy your life." The terrified technician threw his hands up in surrender and frantically mashed the power buttons on his control board. He slammed the master kill switch and furiously dragged his mouse across his monitors. Nothing happened. The bright blue screens did not even flicker. The image of Brittany kissing Laurent remained perfectly illuminated for the entire room to see. "I am locked out," the technician stammered, his voice shaking with pure panic. "The system is completely frozen. The digital input is bypassing the local server entirely. Somebody encrypted the master override and locked the administrative controls. I cannot turn it off." Marcus' face turned a violent shade of purple. He grabbed a heavy metal speaker stand and raised it above his head, preparing to smash the multi-$1,000 soundboard to pieces. But before he could swing the weapon, the crowd began to close in around him. The wealthy guests were no longer just shocked bystanders. They were angry. The extended family members who had listened to Marcus brag about Trey for decades were finally putting the pieces together. Aunt Patricia marched directly up to my father, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "You stole her money!" Patricia shouted, her voice cutting through the ambient chaos of the room. "You literally forged a federal document to steal Maya life savings because your golden boy is a complete fraud. You sat there eating dinner with us while knowing you were under federal investigation." Other guests joined the chorus of outrage. Corporate partners who had heavily invested in Marcus development projects began demanding answers. They realized their own capital might be tied up in Marcus' frozen accounts. The realization that their golden boy was completely broke and that Marcus and Valerie were active accomplices to a federal crime swept through the room like wildfire. The polite high society gala had officially devolved into an angry mob demanding accountability. Marcus dropped the metal stand, his chest heaving as he realized he was entirely surrounded. He could not bully his way out of this. He could not throw money at the problem. He was entirely trapped in a cage of his own making. I stood on the stage looking down at the absolute devastation. I had not yelled. I had not thrown a single punch. I had simply presented the unvarnished truth and allowed their own toxic lies to consume them. My grandfather fail-safe had worked perfectly. Suddenly, the chaotic shouting in the room began to quiet down. A new, highly disruptive sound pierced through the heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom. It was the sharp, aggressive wail of multiple sirens growing louder by the second. I turned my head toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that lined the front of the country club. The dark winter night was suddenly violently illuminated. Thick flashing beams of red and blue light painted the walls of the grand ballroom, cutting through the warm amber glow of the chandeliers. A fleet of black armored SUVs and local police cruisers was rapidly pulling into the circular driveway, blockading the exits entirely. The heavy mahogany double doors of the grand ballroom did not simply open, they were violently pushed apart. 24 men and women wearing dark tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs swarmed into the room. Local police officers flanked them rapidly, fanning out to secure every single exit and block the panicked elite guests from leaving the premises. The sheer visual impact of federal agents storming a billionaire anniversary gala sent a shockwave of absolute terror through the crowd. Women in designer gowns clutched their pearl necklaces in horror. Men in custom tuxedos immediately reached into their pockets to call their high-priced defense attorneys. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe expression and a silver badge clipped to his belt, stepped to the center of the room. He did not ask for silence. He demanded it with his mere presence. The ambient noise of the room completely died. The only sounds left were the harsh crackle of police radios and the heavy thud of tactical boots marching across the polished hardwood floor. The lead agent held up a pristine legal folder. He scanned the room and his eyes locked instantly onto the head table. Brittany was still crumpled on the floor near the side exit, clutching her rapidly swelling ankle and whimpering. 3 federal agents broke away from the main group and marched directly toward her. Brittany tried to push herself backward, dragging her ruined silk gown across the spilled wine and broken crystal. "You cannot do this," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You do not know who I am. My father is a state senator. I demand to speak to my lawyer right now." The lead agent did not even blink. He stood over her and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Brittany Wilson, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and attempting to flee federal jurisdiction," he stated, his voice echoing clearly for the entire country club to hear. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." 2 agents hauled her to her feet, ignoring her dramatic screams of pain as her injured ankle took her weight. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Marcus watched his daughter-in-law being detained and finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He marched aggressively toward the lead FBI agent, his chest puffed out in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus demanded, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. "I am the host of this gala. I demand that you unhand her immediately. This is a private event and you are trespassing." The lead agent slowly turned to face my father. He reached into his tactical jacket pocket and pulled out a second stack of folded documents. "Marcus Wilson and Valerie Wilson, you are also under arrest," he announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The charges are conspiracy to commit wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery of a federal power of attorney document." The crowd gasped loudly. The local politicians, state judges, and corporate executives who had been drinking Marcus champagne just an hour ago physically took several steps backward. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a man facing a federal indictment. Valerie, who had been groggily waking up from her theatrical fainting spell, heard the words "federal document" and began hyperventilating. 2 female agents pulled her up by her arms and forcefully spun her around. "No," Valerie screamed, thrashing wildly against their grip. "I am a pillar of this community. I sit on the board of the country club. You cannot arrest me in front of the mayor." The agents ignored her cries, snapping the steel cuffs onto her wrists with practiced efficiency. Marcus fought back, throwing his shoulder into the nearest agent in a final display of arrogance. It was a spectacular mistake. The agent immediately swept Marcus' legs out from under him and slammed him face first onto the nearest dining table. Expensive silverware and fine china shattered onto the floor as they wrenched his arms behind his back. The untouchable patriarch of the Wilson family was pinned against a table smeared with duck fat and truffle risotto, completely humiliated in front of everyone he had ever tried to impress. The agents began the perp walk. It was a procession of absolute destruction. Brittany went first, limping and sobbing, her expensive mascara running down her face in dark, jagged streaks. Valerie followed, her head hung low, desperately trying to hide her face behind her disheveled blonde hair. Marcus was dragged out last, spitting curses and empty threats at the officers who held his arms. The wealthy elite of the city pulled out their smartphones and began recording the entire spectacle. The meticulously crafted Wilson family legacy was being permanently dismantled in high definition and broadcast to the world. I stood perfectly still on the stage, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the crystal chandeliers as my parents were loaded into the back of an armored federal vehicle. Down on the main floor, Trey was left completely alone. The golden boy of the Wilson family was entirely shattered. He had no money, he had no company. His wife had stolen $500,000 to run away with a French lover. His parents were facing decades in federal prison for trying to cover up his catastrophic failures. He looked around the ballroom and realized that every single person in his life had either lied to him, used him, or abandoned him. His eyes frantically scanned the room until they finally locked onto me. I was the only family member left standing. Trey scrambled up the stairs to the stage, tripping over his own feet. He was weeping, openly hot tears streaming down his face and soaking the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He lunged forward and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging desperately into my skin. "Please, Maya," he sobbed, his voice cracking with pure, pathetic desperation. "Please, you have to fix this. You know how to deal with these people. You have the money. We are family." I looked down at his shaking hand clutching my arm. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No pity, no anger, just a profound, overwhelming sense of closure. I reached over and coldly peeled his fingers off my skin, one by one. I let his hand drop to his side. "I hunt fraud for a living, Trey," I said, my voice perfectly steady and piercingly clear. "You just became my greatest case study. I hunt fraud for a living, Trey," I said, my voice perfectly steady and piercingly clear. "You just became my greatest case study." 3 months passed with the relentless speed of a falling guillotine. The local media had an absolute field day with the scandal. The untouchable Wilson family was suddenly the prime feature on every evening news broadcast and the front page of every financial publication in the state. The absolute chaos of that night at the country club had completely dismantled their meticulously crafted illusion. Brittany was denied bail after federal prosecutors presented her one-way plane ticket to Nice and the encrypted text messages to her French lover. She was currently sitting in a cold federal holding facility wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit instead of her designer gowns. She was facing a mandatory minimum of 15 years for wire fraud, grand larceny, and attempting to flee a federal indictment. Her wealthy political parents completely disowned her the second the FBI raided her townhouse, publicly cutting all ties to save their own political careers. Marcus and Valerie managed to avoid federal prison time, but their alternative was arguably much worse for people who worshipped their own social standing. They were sentenced to 5 years of heavy, supervised probation. They were required to surrender their passports, wear bulky GPS ankle monitors, and report to a federal parole officer who did not care about their country club memberships or their charity gala attendance records. But the true devastation was entirely financial. Paying for a team of elite white-collar defense attorneys drained every single liquid asset they had left. The FBI investigation also triggered a massive IRS audit. Federal agents spent weeks tearing through 40 years of Marcus accounting ledgers and hit him with catastrophic penalties for decades of aggressive tax evasion. Trey commercial real estate firm was completely liquidated by the bankruptcy courts. Every single asset from his imported leather office furniture to his company-leased luxury sports car was seized and auctioned off to pay back his furious investors. The golden boy of the Wilson family was forced to move into a tiny studio apartment above a noisy laundromat. He was working a minimum-wage data entry job just to afford his court-ordered legal restitution payments. He was entirely bankrupt, entirely alone, and completely exiled from the high society circles he used to dominate. But the final crushing blow came directly from the grave. When my grandfather originally established my trust account, he knew exactly who he was dealing with. He knew Marcus had an insatiable greed and a complete lack of moral boundaries when it came to his golden son. So my grandfather had his estate attorneys bury a highly specific punitive contingency deep within the ironclad trust documents. It was known as the fraud clause. The stipulation was beautifully simple and brutally effective. If any family member attempted to illegally siphon, manipulate, or steal funds from my protected account, the trust was legally authorized to immediately claw back the stolen amount plus punitive damages by seizing the offender personal property. The moment Marcus and Valerie forged their signatures on that fraudulent power of attorney, they unknowingly signed away their own lives. They thought they were untouchable, but the bank managing my trust executed the fraud clause with ruthless corporate efficiency. They did not just want the $500,000 back. They demanded immediate full repayment, including massive legal fees, compounding interest, and the specified punitive damages. Marcus and Valerie had absolutely no cash left to pay the debt, so the bank came for the only thing they had left to offer. For 40 years, the sprawling Connecticut mansion had been the ultimate symbol of the Wilson family supremacy. It was a fortress of imported marble manicured gardens and arrogant prestige. It was the house where Valerie hosted her exclusive catered events and where Marcus displayed his expensive art collection. It was the physical manifestation of their massive egos and their lifelong belief that they were inherently better than everyone else. And in one swift legal motion, the bank seized it entirely. I was not there the morning the county sheriff arrived to execute the eviction notice, but my former neighbors were more than happy to share the vivid details. Marcus and Valerie were given exactly 2 hours to pack whatever personal belongings they could fit into a rented moving van. Valerie stood on the perfectly manicured front lawn, clutching a single designer handbag and weeping uncontrollably as the bank representatives officially changed the locks on the heavy mahogany front doors. Marcus stood beside her, his face gray and hollow, entirely broken. They were forced to move into a cramped 2-bedroom rental unit on the outskirts of the city, far away from the elite social circles they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress. The transition of power was now absolutely complete. They had sacrificed my future to save their illusion, and in the process they had lost everything they ever valued. Their reputation was dead, their wealth was gone. Their beloved golden son was a complete pariah who could not even look them in the eye. The bank had no interest in holding on to a massive luxury property. They wanted their money back quickly and efficiently. Just 3 months after the disastrous anniversary gala, a large, brightly colored sign was hammered into the pristine front lawn of the Wilson estate. It was a notice that sent shockwaves through the wealthy neighborhood. The majestic property was not going to be quietly sold through a private real estate broker to protect the family dignity. It was going straight to the highest bidder in the most public way possible. The beloved untouchable Wilson family mansion was officially going up for public bank auction. The morning of the bank auction arrived with a crisp, cloudless sky that felt entirely too cheerful for a funeral. And make no mistake, this was a funeral for the Wilson family legacy. The expansive, manicured lawn of the estate was crowded with a mix of hungry real estate developers, curious neighbors, and opportunistic investors. At the very edge of the property line, standing on the public sidewalk, stood Marcus, Valerie, and Trey. They were completely unrecognizable from the arrogant elites who had hosted the anniversary gala just 90 days ago. Valerie was wearing a wrinkled, off-the-rack coat, her uncolored roots showing starkly against her fading blonde hair. Marcus looked 10 years older, his shoulders stooped and his face unshaven. Trey stood slightly behind them, shivering in the morning air and staring at the ground. I had received a full report from my private investigator the night before. They had already been evicted from their cramped rental due to missed payments and were currently living out of a cheap roadside motel off the interstate. I parked my sleek black town car halfway down the street and watched them through the tinted glass. I could see Valerie whispering frantically to Marcus, gripping his arm. They were harboring a delusional, pathetic hope. They actually believed they could approach whoever bought the estate and charm them into a rental agreement. They were praying that a sympathetic investor would let them lease the guest house in the back just so they could maintain the prestigious zip code and pretend they had simply downsized by choice. It was a tragic final cling to a dead illusion. I opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit holding a single leather folder containing my certified bank drafts. I walked up the long aggregate driveway, moving with quiet, absolute authority. I did not look at my parents. I walked straight to the registration table, handed over my credentials, and took a numbered bidding paddle. The bank-appointed auctioneer stepped onto the grand front porch and addressed the crowd. He read the terms of the absolute auction, meaning the property would be sold today to the highest bidder with zero contingencies. He opened the bidding at $2 million. A developer in the front row immediately raised his paddle. A wealthy neighbor from across the street countered at $2.2 million. The numbers began to climb steadily as a handful of investors fought over the prime real estate. They traded incremental bids, driving the price up to $2.8 million. The auctioneer paused, scanning the crowd for any final offers. I raised my paddle. $4 million, I said, my voice carrying perfectly over the crisp morning air. All cash. The crowd whipped around to stare at me. The developer who had just bid lowered his paddle, instantly recognizing that he was completely outgunned. Whispers rippled through the gathered neighbors as they recognized the estranged daughter of the disgraced Wilson family. The auctioneer blinked, clearly surprised by the massive aggressive jump in price and the all-cash stipulation. "We have $4 million cash," he announced, his voice practically vibrating with excitement. "Do we have 4.1 going once? Going twice?" He slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the podium. "Sold to the young woman in the charcoal suit." It took exactly 3 minutes. The entire auction was over in less than 180 seconds. I had just purchased my childhood home using the exact funds the bank had clawed back from Marcus and Valerie. When the fraud clause in my grandfather's trust had been activated, the bank seized their assets and liquidated them to repay the stolen $500,000. But the punitive damages and compounding interest meant my trust had not just been restored. It had been entirely doubled. My parents' greed had literally financed my real estate acquisition. The crowd slowly began to disperse, murmuring about the stunning conclusion to the auction. I walked past the murmuring investors and stepped up onto the grand marble porch of the estate. I signed the final transfer documents, handed the bank representative my certified checks, and received the heavy brass key to the front door. As the bank officials walked away, I heard the desperate shuffling of footsteps on the aggregate driveway behind me. I turned around to find Marcus, Valerie, and Trey standing at the base of the porch stairs. They looked up at me with expressions of pure, absolute desperation. The realization that I was the sole legal owner of their entire world had finally broken whatever fragile pride they had left. "Maya, please, Valerie," begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. She took a trembling step forward, clutching her cheap coat around her shoulders. "You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We are family. We made mistakes, but we are still your parents. We have absolutely nothing left, Maya. We are sleeping in a motel." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. "We do not want the main house," he said, his voice completely stripped of its former arrogant boom. "Just the guest house out back. We will pay rent. We will sign a lease. You will not even know we are there. Just let us stay on the property, Maya. Please show some mercy." Trey stood silently behind them, tears welling in his eyes, completely unable to speak. The golden boy was finally experiencing the real world. I stood on the porch, looking down at the 3 people who had actively tried to destroy my life to protect their own toxic image. I felt no anger. I felt no residual pain. They were simply strangers who had made catastrophic financial calculations. I raised my hand and pointed directly past them toward the public street. Go find another house, I stated, my voice as cold and hard as polished steel. This one is for my business. I did not wait for their response. I watched them physically deflate, their shoulders sagging as the finality of my words crushed their last delusional hope. They turned around in absolute silence and began the long, humiliating walk down the driveway, trudging toward the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs. I watched them walk away in shame until they disappeared around the corner. I turned back to the grand entrance of the estate. Mounted directly beside the heavy oak door was the old, tarnished bronze plaque that read, "The Wilson Family Estate." I pulled a small screwdriver from my leather bag. With quick, deliberate motions, I unscrewed the 4 mounting bolts and let the heavy bronze plate drop onto the porch with a dull, metallic clang. I reached into my bag and pulled out a brand new, gleaming, polished brass sign. I held it against the brick and secured it tightly in place. The morning sun caught the deeply engraved black lettering perfectly. Maya Forensic Accounting, LLC. I ran my fingers over the cold, smooth brass. I unlocked the heavy oak door, stepped into the massive marble foyer, and firmly pulled the door shut behind me. Blackout. The ultimate lesson here is that true power stems from absolute independence and unyielding boundaries. Her triumphant purchase of the childhood home symbolizes reclaiming her narrative from a toxic family. Their downfall demonstrates that enabling entitlement and committing fraud eventually trigger devastating natural consequences. You cannot endlessly manipulate others and expect them to remain your safety net. Maya proved that the sweetest revenge is never anger, but explosive, undeniable success, and refusing to be a victim. Stand firm in your truth, build your own empire, and let toxic people fall. If this story inspired you, please like and subscribe today.